Hi everyone. Today I would like to talk to you a little bit about documentation. Now, this is something that you may or may not have done before, and I would like to stress how important it is that you are able to both write good documentation and also distinguish good documentation from bad documentation. It is getting more and more important in industry to be able to write documentation. Now, I know that this may not seem like the most exciting thing to be able to do, but I assure you that documentation is actually really important both for other people but also for you. One of the most important things that you can do is be able to make sure that whatever you're working on is repeatable. So let's say, for example, you've been hired as a systems administrator. Now, you are going to want to keep track of all of the things that you've done as systems administrator, both so that you have a record of everything you've done so that you can point to it and they say, well, did you update? And you say, yes, look, I have updated on. But also because then you can have other people do some of the work. So instead of you having to do the exact same thing 50 times, you can have somebody else do it too. So, what we're going to talk about is how to break down an assignment and turn it into a good piece of documentation. Now, I am not going to be doing the assignment for you. I am not even going to be typing anything that makes actual sense. I'm just going to be talking about how you do the breakdown and how to decide if it's good or not. So, we're going to start with first off, let's say you've gotten an assignment. Now, in a lot of times for a lot of classes, the inclination is to basically answer it in line. Now, sometimes that's perfectly reasonable. You can take a copy of the assignment, paste it into a document, and you can start just sort of typing and answering questions. However, for documentation, you can't do that. Some of it is because of the way I've structured the assignment, and some of it is because that's really not documentation. Documentation is used as both a record of what you've done so that you can easily reference it and also a way to show other people what you've done. So let's take the example of the very first assignment for this class. Now, this class is Linux administration. You can find the assignment either under assignments on Blackboard, which is getting your system set up, or if you go to my website and you go to Intro to Servers, when you scroll down, you'll see that I actually have the PDF linked down here. Complete the lab that is bound by this PDF. That's what we're going to be looking at. So when you open it, you'll see that basically what I've done is I've said, here is a problem. It is now your problem. This is what I want you to turn in. Now, the temptation is to just sort of start typing and then call it good. But the first thing that we want to think about is who are we writing this documentation for? So I've actually included some links on my website for documentation. And you can actually see I have some how to do documentation, why is it important, and some resources, including steps to writing documentation. So you can start with doing a plan or a structure before you start actually doing the content. But the first thing that we're going to start with is our target market. Now, the reason we're going to start with our target market is because that's how we can decide the level of detail that we want for our documentation. So let's say, for example, I am asking somebody to create a virtual machine for me. The instructions that I would give to somebody in the very first course, Intro to IT, versus the instructions that I might give to somebody in our last course, say Linux administration, will not be the same. For Linux administration, I'm literally just going to say, yeah, you need to go create me a virtual machine. For Intro to IT, I'm going to give them considerably more detail. You need to create a virtual machine. Here are some options. Here are some links to some options. Here's what these options look like. Stuff like that. Now, the deliverables. So in this case, our target market is somebody who's trying to follow along. We are assuming some technical knowledge, but not expertise. So we're going to pretend like you're writing this document for somebody who's in the Intro to IT class. So that's somebody who is just starting out at school. They maybe don't have a lot of experience or really any experience. They are probably okay installing a program, but they've probably never used a virtual machine before. They don't know what options are out there for virtual machines. They can't just create one, so you can't just say go create it. You have to give them a little bit more detail. I would strongly recommend giving them some screenshots. So, now that we have thought about our target market and who we actually want this documentation to go for, we can start thinking about how we want to set it up. Now, there's lots of different ways that you can set it up. For example, we can run through the problem. So the basic problem is we need 2 Linux systems that are servers. Virtual machines are the recommended option. That's the problem that we are trying to solve. Now, I have broken this down slightly more for you so that you can get a little bit more practice with this. So number 1, you will need to use 2 different Linux distributions, or distros or flavors, depending on who you are talking about it. One must be CentOS. The other can be another server of your choice. You must use the server. You cannot use the regular desktop. You do not want to use the GUI or minimal installs. You must have internet access, and you must be able to share files. Now, reading through this problem with these specifications, you can see that I've given you a little bit more detail about this. Now, again, we want to remember that we are documenting this so that somebody else would be able to follow in our footsteps. So basically at this point, I am assuming that if you are in my Linux administration course, you have worked with virtual machines before, you know how to set them up, and you've done some file sharing. And the reason that I'm going to assume that you know all of these is because of the prerequisites of this course. If you are coming to the website, then, basically these are just some things that you need to know. If not, you get to learn them really quick. So we can, for example, because we need 2 Linux systems that are servers, we could do 2 documents. We could have one document for one, say CentOS, and the other document for the other, let's say Ubuntu. I could also have one be CentOS and then the other be Ubuntu. And I can lay it out like that. Now from here, I know that I have to create a virtual machine. I know that I need to make sure to show how to install OS, show how to check internet, show how to share files, make sure nothing is assumed. So these are the things that I know I need to have because I can see in the breakdown here that I know I need to have 2 different Linux distros. Check. I know that I need to use a virtual machine. That's here. I know that I have to have internet and file sharing because I've mentioned that here. And so therefore, I know that I have to have this on both my systems. Therefore, this can be my general plan. Now, the next thing that we can start looking at is, okay, cool, well, if you just turn this in, I can tell you right now I'm going to send it back. And the reason that I'm going to send it back is because this isn't documentation. Somebody couldn't just follow this in Intro to IT and be able to create these servers for me. We have to break this down a little bit more for them. So we can see that the deliverables: a short document showing how you did the installs, a short document including what you have done for installs and any configurations, and make sure that you've done your file share. So let's say, for example, I want to start with create a virtual machine. Virtual machine options are KVM or VirtualBox. Now I know that I have to, I knew that off the top of my head. You might have to go do more research for this. You may want to do something else. That's completely fine. This is just things that I happen to know. Because frankly, I'm the teacher of the course, and if I didn't know this, I would have some really big concerns about this course. So, now, is this breaking down enough? Well, I don't think it is, because if we're just going to say VM options or KVM or VirtualBox, well, maybe you've heard of VirtualBox, but have you heard of KVM? Probably not. So then you're going to want to say, okay, now I have to go and find VirtualBox. I'm assuming you're using Windows. I'm actually not using Windows, but I'm going to assume you are because most people do. So now I have VirtualBox, and then I have to go over to Downloads, and then I'm going to want to say here, download VirtualBox here, choose, let them know how to install, how to create a virtual machine. Now, because I'm not using Windows, I'm not going to go through the install process because my install process and your install process are likely to look very different. And to be frank, I actually use KVM, not VirtualBox anyway. So these are the blanks that you would now have to fill in. So we've gone from create a virtual machine to breaking down what are our options, where is the link for these options, talking about how to actually do the install, so break that down, give them some screenshots, how to create a virtual machine. Now you can see that they actually have some documentation on here, and you can start to see some of the examples of documentation, FAQs, stuff like that. And you can see like this might be helpful to you. You know what? It also might not be helpful. Is this fun to read? Probably not. But it's important that you learn how to read this so that you know how to do it going forward. So then you can see all of these steps you're now going to need to fill it. You're going to need to give descriptions. You're going to need to give screenshots. And you're going to need to do that for all of these. Now, after you have filled all of this in, the next thing that we can start thinking about is this readable? One of the things that you may notice about a lot of documentation is when you're reading it, it's actually really hard to find what you want. You want to think about how you can break up the documentation that you're making. For example, I have this set up as an outline. Is this the best way to do it for final documentation? You know what? Probably not. I am probably not going to want this set up as an outline. Instead, maybe what I actually want to do is take this and I want this to be a header. So I'm going to make this a really big header. I actually don't want that to be, one. I want to make that underlined so that it's really easy to find. And then I can do the same thing for Ubuntu down here. And maybe you want to make that a title, maybe you want to make that a header, maybe you want to do something else with it. That's fine. However, it sort of is visually appealing to you. But you want to think about, is it easy for someone to be able to read this? Can they find what they need in your documentation? For example, how to check the internet. Well, how do we check the internet? You could, open up a browser, but remember, our virtual machine server doesn't have a GUI or a graphical user interface. So how do we check the internet if we don't have a browser? If you think back to your networking courses or any command line work you've done, you know that we can do ping. So we're going to ping Google. We're also going to spell Google correctly. Now, this is not helpful, in my opinion. Saying, ping Google. Yeah, okay, cool, that's great, thanks. That's not helpful. Instead, what we want to say is, okay, ping Google. Well, this is actually a command. Therefore, I actually want to make it italics and underlined so that I can tell that it's different from the other things. Now, because this is a command, I actually want to say ping google.com. Now, Well, what comes before ping Google? Do you just come up to your computer and yell, ping Google? Probably not. The first thing that you're probably going to want to do is open a terminal and then you can ping Google. So we ended up seeing that, okay, well, this actually isn't even our first step. Our first step is open a terminal, ping Google. If results return good, continue. If no, troubleshoot. Now, this is probably going to be, potentially helpful, but it would actually be even more helpful if we ended up doing something where we were able to show them what we were talking about. So we could, for example, bring a terminal over and say ping google.com. Now we can see what a success looks like. Now that we know what a success looks like, I can go through and I can take a screenshot. So I can come through, I can take my screenshot to show what is a success. I can copy it to the clipboard and I say, okay, well, if good, which is going to look like this, then continue. So this is how I'm able to show them this is a success. Because if I just say, if successful, somebody who doesn't really know what they're looking at may not realize that this is actually good. This is the success. So we want to make sure that we're actually showing, okay, this is actually what a success looks like. You could also show what a failure looks like, and you could very purposefully turn your internet off, show what a failure looks like, and show how to troubleshoot it. So you can see that adding these in here are able to make it so that people can really see what we're looking at. What is a success? What is a failure? What should this look like? If you just say open a terminal, well, maybe they don't know what a terminal is. Maybe they always called it a command prompt. Maybe they always called it a little black box of doom. You don't know. So if you show them, and then you also have some alt text in here so you can make it more accessible for people, then that's a really good way of being able to say, hey, here, follow along. Now you can see that if we start doing this and adding these in for each of our steps, this is going to make it so that the documentation that we're creating is way easier for somebody to follow along with. So now we can start filling the rest of this in and making sure that everything is actually, sort of going the way that we want it to. And then if anything goes wrong, we know we can set it up again because we've written down every single thing that we've done. And you can also see here how much easier it is to read. Well, I would like to find CentOS. Well, I can find that nice and easy because look, it's bold, it's underlined, it's much bigger. I can find the commands much easier because I have underlined and italicized them, so it will stand out from everything else. I can see my screenshots in here so that you can see it's successful. Now, if I was going to be using this in actual documentation, what I would actually probably do is I would actually probably show this with the command so that you could actually see what it looks like. So I would probably screenshot this with just a couple of the results and then include that in there. So rather than this sort of random screenshot that I took, I would say, actually, you know what? Let me just do a couple. Let me copy it to the clipboard. Let me paste that in. And then I can see, sort of very specifically, this is what it looks like. This means everything is going well. It's a nice zoomed in version so that you can read it nice and clearly. So you can actually see like what this might look like and how you can expand it so that somebody would be able to follow along with your documentation nice and easily. Now, I have lots of resources for looking at documentation, what is good documentation, what is bad documentation. You will find so many examples of bad documentation. It's kind of not funny. It's actually a lot harder to find examples of good documentation. And then this breakdown is what you're going to need to do for all of your assignments. So all of your assignments are 1 to 2 pages. The further along in term that we get, the less instructions that I'm going to give you, because I'm trying to model it so that it's closer to what you're going to see in industry. In industry, people are not going to break down the problems for you. You have to start learning how to do that yourself and see what it's going to look like. Now, when you're turning it in, does it have to look like this? No, it really doesn't. There are so many ways that you can do your documentation that are completely fine. It does not need to look like this in any way, shape, or form. This is just one example. You could have multiple documents. You could have your transitions be different. You could have the way that you're calling stuff out be different. You could have a completely different organization. As long as it's easy to follow, easy to read, I can find what I'm looking for. I'm basically going to pretend, okay, if I didn't know what I was doing, could I follow this or am I getting confused? And then I read through your documentation. That's how I'm going to be looking at everything. If you have questions, concerns, please make sure you read through how to do documentation on Blackboard if you're in my course. If you are just coming to the website, please make sure you read through my page on how to do documentation and go to all of my resources. I hope that this was a helpful walkthrough of how you can turn a very short, here is a problem and now it is your problem, into a breakdown with an outline where things are getting put in and how things are getting put together so that you will have an easier time working on things. As always, if you have questions or concerns, please let me know. I am always happy to talk to you, and I hope you are having a lovely day.